Thanks for tuning in to the Mission Matters podcast, where we feature successful, mission-driven leaders committed to creating a positive change in the world. Our mission with this channel is to inspire other leaders by providing industry insights, new ideas, and inspiring stories from the pros.
Hello again. My name is Paul Feith, host of the show where I interview leaders heading up mission-focused organizations, always leading from the heart, inspiring others, and making a difference in their communities. This episode is sponsored by PGM, or Paul Gregory Media, who's also a B certified corporation. I said that wrong, though. It should be certified B corporation. That's somebody at B Corp is going to ding me on that. To find out what a B Corp is or what PGM is, visit paulgregorymedia.com. With me today is Tara Beth Leach. She's a senior pastor at Good Shepherd Church in Naperville. She's not only a pastor there, but a 3-time author, including titles Emboldened, Radiant Church, and 40 Days on Being 6. Tara, I'm going to have to ask you what 6 means or what that number represents.
Yeah.
Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. It's so much fun to be here. And yeah, 6 is Enneagram number, which is something that millennials and Gen Z are really passionate about. It's this idea that everybody has a number 1 through 9, and it's just another real fascinating personality.
A personality trait?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going to have to look that up now. Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't you just tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your journey? What actually got you into ministry in the first place, and what led you to being the senior pastor?
Yeah. So my family was shocked the day that I came home when I was 16 years old and I told them that I wanted to be a pastor. They were shocked, and they spent years actually trying to talk me out of it because it made absolutely no sense. I grew up in a family of real kind of cultural Christians, meaning we went to church, but it was, a handful of times a year. And it wasn't a major part of our lives. Until I was 16 years old, I had this real come to faith moment where God became such a just more central place in my life. And before that, my career choice was either I was going to be a veterinarian or I wanted to be like my dad. My dad was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. He was a motivational speaker. He did the whole Zig Ziglar motivational speaking in the 90s and spoke to corporations really around the globe, and was this incredible entrepreneur, successful businessman. And I wanted to be just like him. And my dad was a giant in my life. And so when I was 16 years old, and all of a sudden, overnight, it was overnight. I mean, I came home, I went on a missions trip to Mexico. And when I came home, I told my parents that God was calling me to be a pastor. And at first, they thought it was a phase that I would just, that'll eventually go away. Eventually, she'll lose interest and she'll go back to her other passions. But I never looked back from that. From that day, I made the decision that I was going to be a pastor, that I was going into full-time ministry, and never looked back. I went to Olivet Nazarene University, where I got an undergrad in ministry. I went to Northern Theological Seminary and have been in pastoral ministry for 20 years. I'm 41 now, and I started pastoral ministry when I was 21. And my passion and love for it only continues to expand and only continues to grow.
So we got to go back to, is it Mexico that you had that epiphany?
Yeah. Yes.
So was there a cataclysmic event that happened that just shook you and said, okay, this is what I need to do? Or was it just
it was a cataclysmic event.
Okay.
So first of all, 16 years old, going to Mexico, seeing the world, right? The first time just seeing the world, and seeing poverty in ways that my brain just hadn't understood as a suburban teenager. And just seeing the globe through different lenses. And one of the things that just struck me was we were in villages where there were Christians who had nothing but the clothes on their own backs. And the joy of the Lord was just contagious. And I remember thinking, there's something here. There's something here. And I remember just having these moments of just like, I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave Mexico. I wanted to stay there and be in the glow of the Lord. And so there was a night that we were doing a Bible study, and the youth pastor was doing a study on Jesus calling the disciples and becoming fishers of men.
Mm-hmm.
And the youth pastor stopped and he said, I think that there's someone here that God is calling to be a pastor, to become a fisher of men. And he said, so I want everyone to bow their head and close their eyes. And if that's you, I want you to stand up. And I was gripping onto my chair. I remember I was sweating. My heart was pounding. And at the same time, I felt like I was going to explode if I did not stand up. I just knew it was me. And I stood up, and then I just started to weep and weep and weep. And I think everyone might have even been more shocked than me that I stood up. See, back then, this was the 90s, not that long ago, but this was the 90s. And a time where, in general, like pastors were not women. And even still today, I mean, the statistic is something like 7% of pastors are women. And I happened to be in a ministry circle as a teenager that didn't affirm women in ministry. They actually did not believe that women could be pastors.
Was that part of the shock when you stood up?
Yes.
Yeah.
They didn't know what to do. But I stood up, and then I just started to sob. I cried for so long. I cried for a couple of hours. They didn't know what to do with me. They asked if they could call home to my parents and asked if I needed to go home. Like, it was just, I was so shook to the core. And so they prayed for me, and I just knew, like, I stood up, I made that kind of surrender before friends, and that was what I had no imagination for what it looked like. At first, when God called me into ministry, the only female that I knew in ministry at that time was Mother Teresa. And so I thought, does this mean like I have to go and like not be married and wear black clothes? Like I had no imagination for what it looked like to be a female in ministry, right? And it's that old adage that we cannot possibly imagine what we don't see, right? And so I didn't see it. My family didn't see it. Friends around me didn't see it. I mean, no one, it wasn't like, I came home and said I wanted to be a doctor, and everybody said, that's exactly what you were made to do. That is your trajectory. It is clear. It makes sense. Everyone around me, it was not clear. It did not make sense. It was just a phase. But that, like, it surprises me to think about now that it never shook me. Like, it never shook my confidence of the call. I just said, well, they'll eventually someday see. And they did. They did see. And eventually my parents became my greatest cheerleaders.
Wow.
My dad died 2 years ago. And he, but before that, he was on the front row every time I preached a sermon. And my greatest cheerleader. And I think about watching my dad as a speaker, as this incredible entrepreneur and leader, as an author. I always thought that I was going to be like my dad in the traditional sense, but I think that I think that his gifts were passed on to me. I do think that I am my father, and his gifts were passed on to me. And God is just using that in the church world and in ministry.
Mm-hmm. Well, going back to that, you wanted to either be a vet, right? Which is still a very helpful service to our community in a very physical sense.
Yep.
And then your father's gifts in speaking, and that's a gift, especially if you could do it well. It seems like those are two very good gifts to have as a pastor and a leader of people, a shepherd of people. So I could imagine, or maybe I can't, but I'm trying to imagine what that moment must have felt like, because it's scary in a sense.
Yeah.
And you were like, I don't want to do this, but I feel like I have no other choice. I mean, maybe that's the true definition of a calling. You knew somewhere that you needed to do this.
And even if it doesn't make sense.
Because you didn't have a plan. You didn't know what that plan would be.
There was no plan. I didn't know what it looked like. I'd never considered it before, not even a little. But from that moment on, to me, it made sense though. Like I had experienced Jesus in ways that was life-changing for me. It was like I could see the world in color for the first time. And I could not live the rest of my life um, without telling the world about what God had done in my life. And I wanted to tell everyone, I wanted everyone to know. And so it made sense to pursue a path where I could do this full time.
So what becomes the plan then? You know this is what you want to do. Your parents aren't fully on board yet, and I guess you're at this point you investigate schools.
Investigate schools. So my parents, their rule for us as kids was, we're going to support you in college. We're going to pay for college. You just have to go. We don't care. Back then, we don't care what you get, just get a degree. Now I had two brothers that studied film, and I think they very much regret that. But
It was also back before it was $500,000 a year.
Right. Yeah. So they asked me like a number of times. They would sit me down and say, you should consider ministry as a minor. Don't do it as a major. Study business, study teaching. Don't. But I was insistent. No, this is the only thing I'm going to do with my life. And so I started to look for schools, and I ended up studying youth ministry because when I was called into ministry, I thought, well, I'll just be a youth pastor my whole life. And so I ended up studying youth ministry. I met my husband, Jeff. My husband, Jeff, is an engineer. He works for NASA. So the joke in our house is it's not rocket science because he's an actual rocket scientist. By the way, we have two boys. They're 11 and 13 years old. But so when Jeff and I met, I was in ministry. And so, which is rare, I think, for a lot of women in ministry. Usually when women are called into ministry, it's later in life, usually, like statistically. And so then what ends up happening is it changes a home dynamic that becomes difficult for the spouse or for the kid because it's this giant career shift and spouses aren't always on board. I had the blessing or luxury of meeting Jeff while I was already in ministry. And so we often joke that well, he knew what he was signing up for, but did he really? Because ministry can be a bear. And there were just not very many playbooks out there for how to do this as a woman in ministry. Plenty of playbooks out there about how to do this in a man's world and a man's way, but not as a woman. And so it's been a lot of figuring that out ourselves and figuring that out myself. So we get married, and I moved to upstate New York. I was a youth pastor up there for a few years, and then we eventually made our way back to the Midwest. And my husband had gotten a job at Northrop Grumman. He does aerospace. So we'd gotten a job at Northrop Grumman, and we were in the western suburbs. And I started looking around for a job, and a job opening came about at Good Shepherd Church in Naperville, Illinois, to be a high school youth minister. And I was like, perfect. I went to school for youth ministry. So I applied, fell in love with the church, and was on staff here for 7 years. And this church really, I call this church my like greenhouse or nursery, right? It was like I was a baby tree, and they grew me. This church nurtured me as a pastor, grew me as a pastor. Watched a lot of flip-flops and mess ups, and they loved me anyway. And so this is where I learned how to preach. I started preaching here in some of the big services at 24 years old, 25 years old.
Oh, wow.
And then eventually, and they sent me to seminary. So I went to Northern Theological Seminary. This church sponsored my seminary. And long story, but I, felt like it was time to spread my wings. And so I ended up leaving here and spent a decade away from here. Never thought I would come back, stayed in touch with all the people here. I mean, lifelong best friends here, but never thought I would come back. And then in 2021, 2022, December of 2022, we really began to have more serious conversations. The church did not have a senior pastor, and they reached out to me. And I mean, it was one of those, one thing just led to another, and then it started moving very quickly. And in March of 2023, I was installed as the new senior pastor here at Good Shepherd.
Wow. And so as of this recording, we're talking about not quite a year yet.
Not quite a year yet. Yeah.
Wow.
But it was just so natural. It was a homecoming.
Yeah.
It was, my boys were baptized here. I had
Mhm.
my babies here and they were baptized here. And to be able to return to the church where my children were baptized, where this church made the covenant and the promise that they would come alongside my children as babies. And now they get to pick up on that promise and come alongside of them. It's just, and I went away for a decade and I grew up.
Mhm.
And I got to come back and,
It's great to have that outside perspective too, you know,
oh yeah. Yeah. I
and
needed
bring
to
that
go.
back with you.
I needed to go. Yes. Completely. I saw the world. I saw the world in that decade and got experience that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise.
Right.
And, I mentioned the gender thing. So, it's even more rare for women to be pastoring large churches. And so it's usually when you see women pastoring large churches, they're co-pastors with their spouse. And so in 2017, I was pastoring a large church in California, and I was the only female at the time. I don't know if that's the case anymore. If there's like one or two of us out there, like in the country. And one of the reasons is just churches aren't ready for it. Churches aren't, they might say they are, but they, in practice they aren't. And so women are having a hard time finding space. And I think one of the reasons why it worked so well here and that it wasn't even a tiny bit controversial is because they knew me. It was, oh, it's Tara Beth. We love her.
From your first
They
10
knew
years.
me. Yeah, they
30
knew
years,
me.
whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, yeah. And because you said those are like pretty much lifelong relationships with some of those people.
Yes. Yes. Lifelong relationships. And so it was just such a natural rejoining, recoming together, homecoming.
So it's a testament to the congregation too. But we had talked earlier about change, and that's sometimes difficult. So just kind of thinking from a leadership lens, and leading through change, tell us a little bit about your experiences with that.
Yeah. Well, anytime a pastor enters into a church, that in and of itself is change. And congregations historically tend to struggle with change. And I think to a degree, like you could create a culture of resilience. And Good Shepherd has a pretty good culture of resilience. At the same time, congregations in general had just gone through a lot of turmoil post-COVID, a lot of political unrest. I mean, massive like political upheaval and unrest and division and polarization. And what we saw, in early 2020, 22, 21, 22 is while churches went to Zoom or went to live stream, you see a lot of pastors doing a lot of shadow boxing of these just kind of invisible frustrations of things that we're hearing on the news. And so then you see people going to different churches and a lot of splits happening. And so the resilience towards change in churches right now is just low. It's just low. But I would say even still, Good Shepherd has a pretty high resilience. And so, but we just like went through a major, major change. And that is with our denominational affiliation. And so we just disaffiliated with our denomination and affiliated to a new one. And that was not led by me, but it took a lot of leadership capital for me and caring for the church and showing the right amount of transparency or vulnerability, putting on a brave face, even when I didn't feel it, and being the carrier of hope was the role that I played in this change. But if there's anything I've learned about leading change in congregations is the unknown is what causes swirling and anxiety. You can never over communicate. You can never, ever, ever over communicate. And I would say that's just a lot of the leadership lessons I've learned in the last decade, is over communicate with this, with the congregation. So I write a weekly letter to the congregation, um, you know, and we create special gatherings for the congregation to be able to hear from me. It's called, so my weekly letter is called the Shepherd's Heart. And then we do gatherings called the Shepherd's Heart Live. And those are just opportunities for me to invite people in what I call the living room of my brain, right? And so it's not necessarily like a concrete vision plan, strategic plan, but those gatherings are for me to invite the congregation into the living room of my brain and think through things with me, and for them to be able to ask questions of things they're wondering. And so that was really, really helpful throughout this process. And I think will continue to be helpful forums for us as we lead through new days ahead and exciting days ahead.
Sure, that's a very approachable methodology that's candid and transparent, even if you don't know all the answers at that point, right?
Oh man, yeah, and our congregation responds. They want just the candid, honest. That's a good. I don't know the answer to that,
right?
But here's what I do know,
Mm-hmm.
and people lean into that.
Yeah, so that's a major change, right? And there's obviously lessons to be learned from that. And great thing that you have a resilient congregation that can weather that storm for the most part. Tara Beth, what else do you do besides lead a congregation? I know you're a writer, and tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I'm in full-time ministry, of course, and my first priority is the local church.
Mm-hmm.
And I often say that I am a pastor who happens to write, and I'm a pastor with a home church who happens to also speak sometimes. Mm-hmm. Meaning, like, I don't lead with being an author or being a speaker. It's more that I have a ministry that has gone public, I guess. And so I pastor very publicly. And so I write for the church. Always anything I ever write is for the church. And so I'm working on a project right now. And that project is going to be turning into a book, but I wanted to give it to the church first. So I've written some things. You've heard me talk a little bit about women ministry, early on. Some of my earliest passions were about empowering women in ministry. So my first book is called Emboldened, A Vision for Empowering Women in Ministry. My second book is called Radiant Church. And Radiant Church was a book that was responding to the turmoil that we saw in 2020 and calling the church to be a radiant witness. I was troubled as a pastor watching a lot of Christians, how do I put this? A lot of Christians tether themselves to politics. I am passionately against Christian nationalism. And I think that becomes really, really dangerous when Christians begin to blend or inflate their faith with politics. I just think it becomes really dangerous. And I'm sorry, conflate the two. And so, So Radiant Church is about calling the church to alternative paths of being the church that Jesus believes that we can be. And then the Enneagram book.
Right.
And then I'm working on some other projects. We've got several video-driven Bible studies coming out, and then a book called Great Morning. And that's probably the one Great Morning that I'm working on right now is probably most exciting project I've ever done.
Oh, wow.
It's about a morning practice that began a few years ago. I was one of those people who would wake up in the morning somewhat despondent and just kind of roll haphazardly into my day. And I started to learn the practice of rising early before dawn. And I started to integrate different practices in my life. And Great Morning became a double entendre for me, which in one sense it meant I'm going to have a great day. Like I would wake up every morning. I am choosing that this is going to be a great day. This is going to be a great morning. And I'm going to wake up before dawn. But then it started to become an acronym, which now stands for gratitude, reflection, exaltation, ask, and trust. And that's a prayer framework. And it's something that I think can help a lot of people frame their days to rise with God and begin choosing that it'll be a great day no matter what comes at you.
state of mind can be a lot of things, right? And can make
Oh
a
yeah.
huge difference in a
And
day.
scripture, like the Bible talks about that. Like psychologists like are in many ways like are putting words and science behind what
Mhm.
scripture talks about. Um, and it's incredible, the brain, like that we can actually rewire our brain and
Right.
that we can't change like our external circumstances necessarily, but we can change how we experience it.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, there's a lot to unpack just in there too, because I'm trying to think of, there's a quote and I didn't even want to bring it up because I don't know if I remember the quote, but Helen Keller, change does not come from out there, it comes from within.
Right. Yeah.
Um, so
Yep.
it's one of my favorite quotes that I
Yeah.
recently learned.
Yeah. The Apostle Paul in Romans 12:1 says, therefore be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Like actually, like we're going to be transformed as our mind is renewed. Um, I mean,
Yeah.
Paul was onto something.
Hmm. So your church is in Naperville, the Good Shepherd church, and I know it's a large congregation. Can you tell us what makes your church unique? I mean, we talked about resilience uh, and the congregation size. What else makes it? I know
Yeah.
we could talk maybe about your programs or.
I'm so biased, but I gotta tell you, I think this is the greatest church in the world.
Well, you came back, so.
Oh, it is so special. And anyone who comes here, there is just a specialness about this place. And it's not the programs, it's not the music, it's not the preaching, it's not the building, it's the people. It is the joy. I mean, you yesterday, I mean, I was just blown away. You know, we had packed out services yesterday, and people don't just like come in and wow, this was great, and they don't just leave, but they linger.
Mhm.
This is a lingering church. And for me, the sign of a healthy church is how long do people linger? Because church is about community, church is about family, church is about togetherness. And yes, we do happen to have amazing music. We've got a contemporary service that, I mean, just rocks out. They write their own music, and it is just, I mean, yesterday I walked in, and I just turned to one of our tech guys. I was like, it is bumping in here. Like it is
Mhm.
bouncing, like people, like it just, the bass. And I mean, but people were just singing. You could hear the people singing. They weren't watching a concert. The congregation was singing. And then in the sanctuary, we also have so we have contemporary and traditional services that happen at the same time. And we have a beautiful choir and this incredible organist and liturgy and with a cafe that, brings the two worshiping communities together between services. And yeah, like there was probably some good preaching. There was some good music yesterday. People got some good coffee. I'm looking out in our cafe right now in our fireplace but people lingered. And they didn't linger because the music was good. And they didn't linger because the preaching was good. They lingered because they love each other. And here's the other cool piece. Like we had new people. We had a bunch of new people show up yesterday. Every Sunday we have new people. And like they just feel it. Like so new people come and then they get introduced to all of these people. Oh, you got to meet this person, you got to meet this person. And so it's not a country club, right?
Mhm.
But it's a place where it's like walking into someone's kitchen and them saying, let's have some chocolate chip cookies together. Let's talk.
Well, that's the new KPI, right? The linger ratio.
That's a great KPI. Yes. I'll have to add that to my board report.
There you go. Well, that actually sounds special, and you sound incredible, Tara Beth. I mean, all because, well, not because of, but that one special day in Mexico that
Yeah.
called you to service, and I think that's incredible. I thank you for being on the show, sharing your thoughts on the church, your thoughts on leadership, and do you have any other parting thoughts for our audience?
Yeah. I would just say that, wherever you are, whoever's listening, if a higher power, if God has or you just have this burning passion to pursue something, but everyone around you is saying it doesn't make sense, don't do it. Sometimes our gut instincts are the right ones. I often say that our faith is embodied, meaning we live out our faith in our bodies. And sometimes those passions or those gut instincts come from something greater. And so listen to it. Don't stop dreaming.
Words to live by. And it certainly worked for you. And I wonder how fulfilled you would have been if you hadn't stood up.
Yeah.
One day.
Yep.
Well, thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate your time today. Until next time, everyone.
Thanks for listening to the Mission Matters podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.